Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is honestly a real game changer in the world of education. We're looking at a landmark research review by Dr. John W. Thomas, and it's all about a totally fascinating and, yeah, sometimes debated model called project-based learning. Okay, let's jump right into this.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll start by defining project-based learning. Then we'll look at the 5 PBL criteria. Ask, does PBL actually work? Cover its impact on problem solving, tackle the implementation challenges, and finally, wrap up with the future of PBL.
All right, Section 1, Defining Project-Based Learning. Let's kick things off by looking at the core problem with how we've, traditionally done things in the classroom. I want you to think back to your own school days for a second. Is traditional schooling actually failing to prepare us for the real world? It's a huge question, right? Because so often, traditional education relies heavily on rote memorization. Cramming rules, facts, and formulas into your head just long enough to pass a Friday test. But true problem solving, the actual kind you need in your career and daily life, looks completely different.
So, enter project-based learning, or PBL. According to the research, PBL is a model that organizes learning around complex tasks, driving questions, student autonomy, and realistic products. Basically, it's an educational revolution fighting against the status quo of what researchers call inert knowledge. Inert knowledge is, it's those facts you have rattling around in your head that you absolutely cannot apply in real life. With PBL, instead of a teacher just lecturing at you for an hour, students are actively learning by designing, problem-solving, and making decisions over a long period of time.
Moving on to Section 2, the 5 PBL criteria. Now, it's super important to realize that not every single project you do in school actually qualifies as true PBL. John W. Thomas lays out this strict rule of 5 to help us mentally separate real, rigorous PBL from casual classroom activities. Number 1, centrality to curriculum. The project is the main teaching strategy, not just some fun add-on at the end of the week. Number 2, a driving question. This forces students to really grapple with the central concepts. Number 3, constructive investigation. It has to involve real inquiry in creating new knowledge, not just mindlessly following a lab manual. Number 4, student autonomy, meaning students need unsupervised work time and real choices. And finally, number 5, realism and authenticity. The challenge has to feel completely real, not just like a school-like assignment. This comparison brilliantly illustrates the difference. Think about building a papier-mâché volcano at the end of a science unit. We've literally all been there, right? Covered in paste, making a total mess of the kitchen table. That is a traditional project. It's just an enrichment activity that happens after the real learning is already done. True PBL, on the other hand, would be something like investigating and solving a local water quality issue in your actual town. The students are encountering the core scientific concepts actively through the authentic challenge of solving that real-world water problem. Which brings us to Section 3, does PBL actually work? Okay, so this all sounds absolutely wonderful in theory, right? But let's look at the hard data to see if it actually delivers results or if it's just another progressive education fad. Get a load of this number, 90%. That is the massive average attendance rate found across schools using expeditionary learning, which is a super comprehensive PBL model. The research shows that when you give students authentic, challenging projects, their motivation just skyrockets, rates of disciplinary problems drop, and the entire vibe, the whole climate of the school, completely transforms. Turns out, students actually want to show up when the work matters. But what's really fascinating here is the impact on basic skills. Let's talk about the data from Dubuque, Iowa, spanning 1995 to 1997. After bringing in PBL, reading gains in one school jumped 15%, and in 2 other schools, they skyrocketed by over 90%. These schools went from way below the district average to above average. And the kicker, the projects weren't even specifically targeting basic reading drills, but the general engagement and motivation just spilled over and massively boosted their academic achievement. Let's get into Section 4. Impact on problem solving. So we know they're engaged, but what kind of knowledge are these students actually retaining? To answer that, we're going to anchor on this really fascinating 3-year longitudinal study by researcher Joe Bowler. Bowler basically compared 2 British secondary schools that had totally identical student demographics. The traditional school relied on textbooks and rule-bound didactic instruction. Basically, the teacher talks, you listen. And the students there, they reported that math was boring, tedious, and just an exercise in remembering rules. But the PBL school used open-ended projects, exploration, and gave students actual choices. And those students viewed math as a dynamic, flexible subject that required real thought.
Now, when it came time to take a national standardized test, The results were incredibly revealing. Both schools actually tied on procedural questions. You know, the ones you answer by just pulling a rule or formula straight from memory. But the PBL school completely dominated on the conceptual questions. These are those tricky curveball questions that require you to creatively apply rules to brand new, unseen problems.
The crucial point here is captured perfectly by Bowler. She noted, students taught with a more traditional model developed an inner knowledge that they claimed was of no use to them in the real world. That's huge. The traditional students literally couldn't use what they learned to solve novel problems. PBL students, on the other hand, developed flexible knowledge. They actually learned how to think, not just what to think.
All right, Section 5, the implementation challenges.
Now, it's time to pivot a bit, because we have to talk about the catch. If PBL is so highly effective, why on earth isn't every single school doing this? It's a perfectly fair question to ask. Well, the messy reality is, executing this properly in an actual, noisy, real-world classroom is incredibly difficult. We really need to have some serious empathy for educators here, because without massive structural support, implementing true project-based learning can feel a lot like pushing a boulder up a hill.
Let's look at the student side of things first, based on researcher Joseph Krajic's findings. Believe it or not, students really struggle with generating meaningful scientific questions. Left to their own devices, they often just want to pursue questions based on what they personally like, rather than actual scientific merit. They also have a really hard time managing the sheer complexity and all that unstructured time. Plus, taking raw data and transforming it into insights or building logical arguments, that's tough. They need a whole lot of scaffolding to actually learn how to learn this way. And for teachers, the list is even more daunting. They are facing intense time constraints and fixed resources. They have to somehow balance student autonomy with keeping classroom order, and let's be real, nobody wants total chaos in their room, especially right before lunch. They also have to relinquish control of the information. That's a scary shift when you're so used to being the expert at the front of the room. Add to that the fact that designing authentic assessments takes forever. Put it all together, and it creates a massive cognitive load on teachers who are just trying to manage all these messy moving parts while still covering a strict state-mandated curriculum.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the future of PBL.
So, how do we synthesize this tension between the amazing research and the very difficult reality? Well, here is the unavoidable clash: the messy reality of authentic inquiry versus the strict requirements of standardized testing. While the research totally proves PBL develops flexible, real-world problem solvers, it directly conflicts with the current educational push for rigid, standardized testing and quick coverage of a million broad topics. It takes a lot of time for students to grapple with a complex problem. And time? That's a luxury most schools feel they simply don't have right now.
So I'll leave you with this. Can our educational system evolve to support the messy reality of true problem solving? Or are we just going to remain stuck in rote memorization? It's a massive challenge, but the data clearly shows what's at stake for the next generation of thinkers. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. I highly encourage you to dive into Dr. Thomas's research further to see how we might start bridging this gap. See you next time.